This is the Outpost RBA Podcast, where we lead security teams to higher ground and new perspectives needed to secure the frontiers of enterprise, with hosts Will Robus and Stuart McIntosh.
Hello, and welcome everyone to the Outpost RBA Podcast. I'm Will Robus, and I'm here with Stuart McIntosh. Stuart, how are you doing today?
Wonderful. Excited. We got questions today.
And this is our fourth episode, so hopefully we're getting a little better at this with each one. I think the intro itself gets a little less awkward with each episode, but yeah, so we're having fun enjoying this and excited to share all these conversations and episodes with everyone. So we always like to start off with a couple of call outs, ways that you can get involved with kind of this RBA defender community we've built up, as well as with other security professionals that essentially are part of the community. Again, we're focused on kind of threat detection, blue teaming, security alerting, and all the things innovative and impactful around this important and complex field. So the first way you can get involved is with the RBA community. We have a community website at rba.community, as well as a Slack channel that is very active with a lot of security practitioners, partners, as well as splunkers. I think we're almost pushing 800 people now.
Almost.
And it's
so
fun.
People should sign up so that we can next time say over 800.
Yeah, and we can always just keep making up the number too if it slows down. But it's been fun. It's been really fun to see kind of the requests come in and the people join, and it's definitely a global community. So it's been fun to see that grow, and it's really become the watering hole for everyone that has experience with risk-based alerting, implementing it. From a technical side, operational side. And Stuart likes to mention that pretty much anyone who's given an RBA talk at .conf is in the community and actually fairly active. So the second part of that community is we host 1 or 2 events a month around risk-based alerting and threat detection. I think we might be changing up that format a little bit, but those meetups have 2 or 3 kind of primary goals. Number one, just to connect people and get kind of break down some of these virtual walls and silos that just exist inherently with what we do and how we do it. And then to help people get started down the path of risk-based alerting in the organization. There's a lot of resources and a lot of experience representing the group. So we just want to try to connect people to those resources, both digitally, online, as well as people's experience. And then we also have part of those events that are Q&A, where people can bring their questions, again, kind of leveraging this expertise that we have. And that's been exciting to see evolve as well. I know, Stuart, you maybe comment quickly on just the types of discussions and questions that we kind of have there.
Yeah, it's great because it's not like what you see in like community posts or blog articles. It's very relevant, very tactical. Hey, this is what's going on. How do you suggest either troubleshooting something or approaching something? So I really enjoyed just how relevant the questions are to helping either that person or their company.
Yeah. And then kind of along those lines, from a more general approach to helping people down the RBA implementation journey, there are periodic workshops focused on specific pieces of, especially like Splunk Enterprise Security. So last week there was a breakout workshop by another Splunk partner that talked about assets and identities. So kind of a deep dive of that framework and how we can leverage it best in risk-based learning. So again, all the events are posted on the RBA.community website, as well as you can get access to some of the recordings from some of the deeper dive workshops. So a great resource and a great connecting point. And then finally, Splunks.conf is coming up in Vegas in July. As we're recording this, we're making plans to host them in real life meetup with people as part of the community and people part of our network. So that should be posted on the community website, or should be kind of linked on our social sites. So check that out. If you're coming to .conf, we'd love to see you in person. I mean, we're excited because we've been doing this through about 3.5 years, which puts us at, the first 6 months of the company was before COVID, and the rest of it has been during or after COVID. So .conf last year for us was our first opportunity to see people in person, and it was a 3-day whirlwind of like, oh, I've seen you on Zoom, or I've talked to you a whole bunch of times, and like you get to shake your hand. And
people are much taller than I thought they would be. Right? Because I have no idea when everyone's on webcams. It's like, wow, you're taller than me. I wouldn't have guessed that.
Yes. So no, it's an opportunity. So hopefully you can get an opportunity to come out if you're interested. And we'll look forward to seeing you out there in the middle of July. So all right, that's kind of the housekeeping announcements. So let's get into the meat of the conversation today. So today we are going to do a bit of a Q&A episode. And when Stuart and I were talking about this format and why we thought it was important, or kind of some of the conversations we wanted to bring to light, was we obviously spend a lot of time in these meetups and these community events. The Slack channel is very active with questions. And the primary makeup of the population is definitely like on the technical side. So we might get some directors and managers and VPs, but it's a lot of practitioners, which is kind of the cool part about the group. But we do spend a lot of time in cycles on the technical heavy lifting, which is again how you get this done. But in our experience, we've seen a lot of there's a big component of this, and we've talked about it in other episodes about the people component and kind of the change process. And I mean, it's new, it's different. We always say it's not difficult, but it is different, and there's a learning curve and there's an implementation curve, and you've got to get multiple groups involved in it. So we want to kind of bring to light some of these more softer skill questions, if you will, especially under the lens of where people get stuck or where they get frustrated, or even not how to start, but like how do I think about starting and framing it. So our born in the 80s minds went back to a couple of what we call them shows, I guess. So the first one being, the Fraser Crane show, where we get and I haven't watched those episodes in a while, but you get these clips that come through, and like the number of like famous people cameos calling in is like it's kind of a fun thing. I think every week they had a different sort of famous person, but yeah, they absolutely the kind of working through people and process issues, almost the Fraser Crane style. And then of course from our college days, the infamous love line with Dr. Drew. So those were kind of two of the spins we thought of when we were trying to describe the Q&A, I guess, intent of what we wanted to talk about here. So we're gonna steal or borrow a little bit from that, and so we're calling this episode Blue Line with Dr. Stu. So
air quotes around the doctor.
Air quotes, but yeah, I mean, I'm sure we can get you a PhD online for like $30 somewhere.
Yeah, from something.
So,
and I love the concept of. I miss the concept of call-in shows. I miss the concept of just real conversations. We're so structured with social media, these typed out questions and stuff. I like the interaction of the call in, or at least the ability to ask these types of questions.
Yeah. And we get a little bit of that conversation in the community meetup kind of Q&As. But we want to try to take it a level deeper here. So we've got some questions today that we've collected from the community. We kind of organize them today around a common thread about kind of detection development planning or strategy. And we know MITRE is definitely a huge influence in these discussions, and every company is talking about MITRE, asking about MITRE. So we'll get into that a little bit, but it's something that Stuart and I have talked about for years, and you first kind of framed it for me, I mean, years ago, when you kind of gave the phrase was MITRE attack isn't a bingo card. And as I first looked at it and got familiar with it, that phrase really resonated with me. And I happened to run into and meet Bryson Bort a couple of weeks ago when I was in St. Pete, and we were just kind of I wasn't familiar with him. I know Stuart's followed him for a long time, and we were just kind of riffing about cybersecurity and what our approaches were and kind of like some of the challenges and stuff. And of course I brought up the MITRE attack bingo card line, and Bryson's like, that was me. I put that in a presentation and have been tweeting about it for years. And I'm like, well, that's probably where Stuart got it from. So that was a fun.
Will, I think now's a good time for me to tell you that I synthesize what a lot of great people evangelize online. So my apologies if I steered you wrong in the beginning, but yes, there is some wonderful contributors in the community.
Yep. Standing on the shoulders of giants. And you just described my entire career, but I do it in real life as well as online. So, So all right, let's get into the first question. And this comes over our Slack channel, actually. And we are calling this caller today Prioritizing in Philly. So Prioritizing in Philly asks, for organizational priority and leveraging some of Splunk's content, such as Splunk Security Essentials or Enterprise Security Content Update, does anyone have any tips for prioritization of this content? Is there a methodical approach to prioritizing detections as we try to decide which detections to focus on or which detections to release? Any resources you can point me to would be greatly appreciated. So what are your thoughts on that, Stuart? And maybe start from the end of it, which is, are there any resources that you can point to?
There are resources. And this gets back into a lot of these answers traditionally come back as something technical. So the resources that I quite frequently reference is research.splunk.com. It's a web view of the content that Prioritizing in Philly mentioned. So Splunk Security Essentials, Enterprise Security Content Update, all of the stories in it, all of the detections are actually online in a web view. And the reason I like that is, so you can find it at research.splunk.com. The reason I like it is you can browse by technology, you can browse by data model, you can do just a keyword search. So it's very flexible, because when they first stood up some of these detection lists, it was 100, maybe 150 detections. I think now they're over 1,200, maybe even more than that. And so because of that, it's too big to browse visually. You have to find a way of circling a marker around stuff that's relevant for you. And so that's why I go to that. And then there's other, like, I know Elastic released a bunch of their security detections. I know there's Yara or Sigma rules that you can see. So there's lots of places to find ideas for detections. but not a lot of them address what they're actually asking, which is, how do I prioritize this? Like, how do I pick? Okay, so there's lots of great ideas, but what should we be looking for? What order should we be doing this? And what's interesting is this has been kind of a more recent development that we've seen in companies is dedicated detection engineering teams or resources. Back in the day, which sounds terrible, but we used to, like, literally the people who had to handle alerts wrote alerts. And so it was easy to pick priorities because you already had a sense of what was going on or what was missing. Like, you knew adjacent things to continue adding. And you didn't have much time to write a detection because there's another alert. Let's go handle it. So you literally had like these little windows of time to try something. And if it worked, put it in. But now that we have dedicated teams and efforts and capabilities, this has kind of emerged, which is, how do we organize what this team should work on? So where I really like is, where are you currently? Some companies have only a handful of detections. They're kind of default ones. Other companies already have a bench of custom ones. It could be over 100. It could be 50. So just where are you right now? And when I say where are you, it's not just what data is it leveraging, but also what behaviors are you trying to catch? So that's what I do. If we kind of look at these engineering teams, the first few rounds you do of detection planning should really be centered around your data. What do you have right now? It's available. Let's extract value and visibility out of what you have right now. So in my mind, this first kind of initial phase should be very much data driven. And then you can shift to what might be missing from your data. Like, hey, we have endpoint event logs, but we don't have sysmon, or we don't have process level logging. Okay, let's look at enhancing that. So that could be an output of these first couple of rounds. And then the other thing to look at is, we're using the data, but are we catching behaviors that we want? And so that next round, like second, third, fourth, I really start looking at adversary simulation tests. So this is Atomic Red Team. If you're looking for open source stuff, Caldera. I think there's a company called Prelude that has a community edition. Start running malicious tests, and then that'll tell you, hey, I know this was bad. Let's add it to the list.
We'd be remiss not to mention Bryson's company.
We could cite. Yep. Sorry, my apologies. And then there are people who specialize in this type of activity, like Scythe, and can really help. But what's great about Bryson's group is, if you've done the work of knowing your data and leveraging it with your current detection set, you get immediate value out of the services from Bryson's group, because you're not playing catch up. You're able to act on these more specific or nuanced behaviors much easier and interact with the findings. So I definitely think what they offer is amazing, but it shouldn't be out of the gate what you should be doing. Figure out your data first, figure out your detections first.
And I mean, with risk-based alerting and its layered approach, you essentially, as you add more data or kind of expand your detections, it's really making your notables and alerts that much more enriched.
Yep. Yeah, they play off each other. So when you look at a test that runs out of AdSim, instead of saying, I need a detection for this whole thing, instead you can kind of break it up into units and say, well, a file was written to the computer in a weird spot. Okay, that's a detection. And then that file out of a temporary area was executed. Okay, that's a detection. And what we can do is say, well, is one of these worse than the other one? Yes. And that's where RBA can really come in, where you don't have to put as heavy of an engineering burden on these, because what we're doing is we're simply noting anomalous behaviors and writing them, recording them. Yeah. And that I appreciate the person's question, because as you shift into RBA, you should look at detection, prioritizing, and planning differently, right? Like now you can suddenly start doing things like, I remember the first time we did a first time login detection. So the very first time Will signed into any computer, we made a note of it. That you cannot do as a traditional detection. It is way too loud. It is the actionability of it is so low that immediately analysts will tell you to turn it off. This is meaningless. But when you layer it with RBA and a low risk score, now all of a sudden you can say, hey, this account appeared to be phished. And now all of a sudden it's logged into 3 different servers that it's never done before. And now all of a sudden it paints a very different picture of what's going on. So I appreciate the desire to plan and kind of map out this content, because that really is the right mindset you should have.
Yeah, and I wanna unpack that just a little bit more, because I think it's something that we've been talking with everyone about recently, is kind of so again, if you're starting with RBA or even trying to like just show some value from it, there's kind of 2 sort of goals or strategies from a rollout standpoint. And the way we talk about them is, number 1, kind of like improving your current alerting. So like essentially trying to dial in the volume and the fidelity or the accuracy.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be your kind of existing data sources, existing detections. You know, how do we upgrade them to this kind of enriched context of RBA, right? So and the kind of the descriptive term we say when we say that is like seeing your alerts, seeing your current alerts in a new light, right? But what I like to kind of bring up as maybe something that people don't think of just obviously or off the cuff is, if you have data sources that are underutilized or way too noisy even, then you sort of have a green field of building out RBA to improve your visibility, but in a managed way. So like you're not, crushing them with volume because of how the RBA notables and stuff are structured. So the tagline there we call is essentially seeing threats we haven't been able to see before, with data that hopefully is there and just not being able to be leveraged in kind of that traditional one-on-one sense. So that's just kind of 2 lenses that helps focus that, detections that you look for, or even the data that you're approaching.
And if you're planning this stuff out, bin them. Say, hey, this expands our visibility, or this improves our noise, or like it's perfectly fine to kind of classify what is helping extend our fence. Like we talk about securing these front lines. Part of that is we're always looking for efficient ways of moving that fence out so that we have greater control of our environment. But if we're not doing that in a way where the noise isn't trampling us, we're not doing it well. So it's that balancing act of knowing when to push forward and know when to process what we already have. And you have to kind of balance both of those with this planning.
Yeah. All right. Well, so prioritizing in Philly, hopefully that gives you some food for thought and some direction. Yeah, definitely a more complex answer than, you can write up in a blog. And of course it's a Q&A, as much as we try to like give answers, essentially any answer is always, it depends, right? So
it depends.
We're just trying to unpack the it depends a little bit. So, all right, let's get to the next question. And this comes to us from Migration in Memphis. And the question is, we have over 100 traditional detections and would like to migrate them to RBA. How should we attack this? For example, do we just add the risk analysis response action to each existing detection? Do we write new ones using the base searches? What are the best practices here?
Yeah. Very common. We almost every place we walk into, it's a coin flip if this is what we walk into with a large bench of traditional detections. And so let's use some phrasing here. When we say traditional, we also sometimes say one-to-one. What we mean by it is you run this search and it directly triggers notables or alerts that something else has to process. Could be automation, could be analysts. We're balancing that. We're opposing it with RBA. And an RBA detection, we run the search and we record the results, and then a different search processes all of the recorded events to then trigger an alert. So I just want to frame it for people that know RBA. This might be old hat, but for anyone listening that's like, well, what do they mean by traditional? That's what we mean. Now, in that definition or clarification of what we mean, you'll notice the way the output is used is very different. So when it's going to an analyst, we want to reduce the number of events. We want to collapse as much as we can so that we're not interrupting them too much. But when you're doing RBA, you don't have to do all that collapsing. You don't have to do all that filtering or reduction. You can record larger result sets. So you could write a detection that when it runs, there's 5,000 events. That's okay. That doesn't mean there's going to be 5,000 alerts. That's why we're doing this. And so I prefer not to just simply add risk analysis to current detections, because the way you wrote that detection, you had a different end result in mind. So let's start fresh. Let's clone that search and let's start playing with, well, now that we know it's being recorded and analyzed later, maybe we add different fields. Maybe we remove filtering. I always try to clone it and then approach it from how does this help with visibility and recording, as opposed to how do I make it actionable for an analyst? You don't have to worry about that when you're doing RBA. So I definitely say clone it. Don't just add stuff. The other thing we run into is, frequently we will see throttling used. So there's two hallmarks of a traditional alert that you won't, or a traditional detection versus RBA. One, you will see field level throttling, preventing reoccurring hits on an alert. It could be by the machine, by the user, but you'll see some sort of throttling where it says, hey, if I fired this before, don't fire it again for X amount of time. In RBA, we want true representation. We want, if you found this and it occurred, write it, record it to the risk index. Don't throttle this. So if you found it each hour, record it for each hour. Don't suppress it. Don't throttle it. And then the other hallmark is frequency of runs. So we'll call this search windows or the schedule of the detection. Traditional ones are really heavy. Like they'll tend to run every 5 minutes, 10 minutes, because a while ago we felt immediacy was more important than accuracy. Like we wanted to know right now, rather than a complete picture, we wanted to know right now. And now that we've added so many layers to detect on that are running all the time and they're helping enrich the picture, we can actually relax that frequency of run to every 30 minutes, every hour. And so that's the other reason I recommend cloning, is the way you look at your data and process it may be different. So those are the big ones. The other kind of third point I want to make, sometimes it can seem like we're vilifying traditional alerts, right? It could be like, if you're not all in, you're not in. There is a time and a place for traditional alerting. we frequently see it when a company is under an attack or a breach. They're quick to deploy. They're very targeted. You immediately want an analyst to work on it. But then what we suggest is, as that time goes by, rotate it out, move it into an RBA detection. But by no means does that mean you're a bad detection group for having a traditional alert. Sometimes it makes sense. Just know when it makes sense for you as a group, and just make sure everyone's on the same page.
Got it. And then kind of a follow-up, or maybe an unpack, and this relates back to the prioritization piece that we talked about earlier. But when planning, and we've done, many of these migrations from the existing detection set, and 50, 100 detections. Any kind of insight or guidance on triaging that, or making kind of the plan, or how what's the best way to try to break it up and attack it?
So the number of detections you have does not indicate how secure you are. So I just want to get it out there. It's not whoever has the most detections wins. So if we can relieve ourselves of that pressure, that burden, then we don't feel pressured to have 1,000 detections. Great. So how should I look at detections? Absolutely, there should be, back to that planning. Have a roadmap. How should we approach migrating our current detections? There was one company we helped. They had 54 endpoint detections. One technology, 54 discrete detections for it. And what we are able to do is, when we go to RBA, we were able to actually consolidate it into 3, because stylistically it was 3 very different behaviors or sets of logs, sets of events. But then we were able to do things like, well, if the criticality from this EDR is this high, change the score. Or if it's this signature, change the score. You can add dynamic settings based on what is found in each event. And this concept of making dynamic responding or dynamic responding alerts, detections, really helps you consolidate that stack. And the reason I enjoy helping people consolidate is, all you have to do with anyone who has over 100 detections is say, when's the last time each detection fired? And is it working properly? Because all of a sudden it snaps into view. There's an obligation whenever you enter a detection into production that it works. Everyone's counting on it working. The SOC is, leadership is, your peers are. So how are you verifying it's working? And what you're trying to do is reduce that overhead, reduce how many things might not be performing. How can we reduce the number of parts involved in the car?
Yeah.
So there's less complexity.
Yeah. I mean, what you just said was very rich and had a lot of layers. And so I want to close.
Sorry.
No.
Take a spreadsheet and just figure it out.
Yeah, no, we could have a whole discussion. We might have a whole discussion on this sometime, but two loops I wanted to close that I pulled out of what you just said. Number one, back to what you said about, the content packages and being a source for inspiration or ideas.
Mm-hmm.
So that so from 54, you had 54 ideas that you turned into 3 essentially programs. And that goes into kind of the second loop I wanted to close about the whole dynamic aspect. And we get a lot of questions about machine learning and machine learning use cases, and without belaboring kind of what the merits are and the approaches and stuff like that, like the way I describe RBA in a machine learning kind of context is almost like it's an inverse reality, where we take and we program the machine, which are these detections, with all of this security experience, right, from the people writing the detections and the decisions you make about the scoring and the dynamic kind of variables, if you will, and then fold that in with business logic, right? So all of a sudden you have this now detection machine that is running at massive scale and in near real time with all of this experience intelligence, all of this business logic and business rules to say, all right, this is what's super important to us at this incredibly granular level. So I mean,
detections are the ability for the detection team to take a technology and infuse it with their knowledge and experience. That is a detection. There's no greater expression of infusing all that experience, all that knowledge into something actionable for someone else other than a detection. It is not a factory line. It is not producing interchangeable widgets. What it's doing is attempting to scale that what's in that person's mind across the entire environment for other people to process.
Yeah. And that's, and then, all right, so one more loop I have to close before we go to the next one. And so when I say the inverse of kind of like traditional machine learning approach is we bring in the automation and machine piece with that adversary simulation. So we're testing the human program machine with this automation and onslaught of scenarios. And then we ask the question of, did we see what we needed to see? Did we miss anything? Because it's a known, it's the traditional, like the training, machine training thing is you've got this known set of threats or behaviors that we're going to run through our intelligence piece and make sure that we got the results that we expected on the way in. So anyway, that's, we're getting into some like sort of academic weeds, but the machine learning, it's a buzzword and it's got incredible potential in a lot of different areas. We're just moving it kind of down that stack as opposed to a first frontline kind of thing.
I think it's what you reach for next, not what you reach for now. You need to set this stage. You need to get under control what you're seeing, what you're protecting. And then an option for expanding that fence could be ML. Absolutely. It could be new data sources. It could be ML. Now you're innovating how you see. But in the beginning, we have to set, okay, what are we protecting and how well are we doing it?
Awesome. And that's well said and a perfect lead into the next question. And our final question for the day that comes from MITRE in Minneapolis. The question is, we are being asked to cover all MITRE techniques with detections, and we're struggling to fill in our spreadsheet. Where should we look for sources of detections take to MITRE techniques in order to get to 100% coverage?
Bingo
card. So here we go.
Here's the good news. They didn't say sub techniques. So that takes a couple hundred off the board. That's great. Do we ever get asked this, Will? Have we encountered this in the wild?
Yeah, it's I mean, I have to say it's probably the default strategic approach. And there's a lot of reasons for that, I think, but I mean, you introduced MITRE to me when we first started this company, and I was impressed by it. But for me, it was sort of a very detailed mental model, if you will, of this is how we're going to attack. This is how we could get attacked. And this is the taxonomy for how we can sort of make sense of it. Right. So it's an index. It's a contextual breakdown of all of this craziness that is coming after us from inside attackers as well as outsiders. So I I've got a good appreciation for what it is, thanks to discussions we've had about it, and trying to answer this question, right? Like, people ask the question, and we want to answer it, and if it's so
I used to be almost offended that this is the approach to detection engineering. Like, I used to be very and what helped me kind of drop some of that is exactly the prior questions. So what was asked earlier was, what are the resources for telling me how to prioritize detections? And what you could read into that is measuring what I'm missing. Like, what don't I have that I should be looking at? And everyone's quick to dump individual things, but no one's quick to say, here's how to get better. And I think in that absence, in that void, the MITRE technique list came out, and it immediately is relatable to leadership. Oh, there's a list somewhere of bad things that could be done. I feel like we should cover it. So then I started getting less frustrated and started kind of using it as a discussion point to say, well, how should we use MITRE ATT&CK? And whenever, and this is the funny thing, MITRE has multiple projects, especially in the cybersecurity space. They have Defend, they have ATT&CK, they have Caldera. But whenever you hear MITRE, just the word, the company name MITRE in security, 9 times out of 10, they're referring to MITRE ATT&CK as the framework. And I think I like how you phrased it. It's a good lens to view these behaviors that your detections are seeing. So how do we classify the behaviors being seen? Oh, that file being executed from 10, that's process execution. Oh, it's a PowerShell script. Okay, so it's not only a process, it's PowerShell. Cool. It's a classifier. It's not, if you have it, you're good. And so that leads to, whenever we talk to someone who's trying to fill out one of these spreadsheets, my question to people is, hey, I see you say that this technique is covered, and I'll use air quotes, it's covered. What does that mean to you? And they say, well, we have a detection for it. Great. How many variants does that detection account for? What? What do you mean variants? And it's like, well, that behavior, that TTP, there's like 12 different ways of doing it. So here, I'll use one, data compression. So you and I, we have a detection for data compression. And so we can check that box. But it covers things like WinRAR.zip, 7-zip. But there's other compression technologies, and they're always shifting. There's other command line utilities, there's vendor products, there's standalone ones. So is that technique technically covered? And what does covered mean when you communicate it to leadership? That we're preventing it, that we see all artifacts of it, or that we have pushed in to viewing that type of activity. So I'm not against this idea of a spreadsheet of MITRE, but I feel like it shouldn't be what's leading your detection planning. It should be used to evaluate where you're standing and where you want to be. Like, hey, one of the ways we did it at one of the companies I worked with, we noticed we were really heavy on execution. That entire tactic, we're great. If processes kick off, where we were really light, discovery techniques, where people start poking what IPs are available, what file shares, am I on a domain? And so we realized, wow, we don't have much visibility there. And so we used MITRE to push into those types of techniques. We're not going to say we're covered, but we're going to say we're augmenting what we see. We use it to identify blind spots or weak spots that we should get better in. And I think you need to have a very specific and open dialogue with whoever's involved in setting the spreadsheet of techniques about what is your intention versus our use of this approach, so that everyone's on the same page. Because I don't I don't want you to say, hey, we're covered. You get popped for a technique you said you're covered on, and then leadership is yelling at you. You said we're good. That's not what we meant. We meant we're exploring this stuff.
Yeah, and to kind of expand on the bingo card analogy, if you do treat it as a bingo card, then it's very susceptible to being gamed, right? In your advantage or disadvantage, right? It just depends on where you're sitting. So,
is your goal to say yes on the spreadsheet, or is your goal to stop bad on your network?
Yeah.
And if your goal is to stop bad on your network, it may result in a better spreadsheet, but the inverse is not necessarily true or a given. It's not a given.
And the positive sort of spin, I would put, not spin, but the approach that we take and what you just described was, I mean, so all the detections that we put in are mapped to a MITRE tactic or technique.
And technique. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so they're mapped to it. Is it 1-to-1, or can they have kind of multiple?
That's the other problem.
Yeah.
Remember when we said we consolidated from 54 detections to 3? Which techniques are now suddenly covered?
Yeah.
Multiples.
Right.
And so we even go a step lower and say, if it's in a given event, let's dynamically assign technique. Which, how are you going to do that on a spreadsheet? You're going to list all 27 possibilities. It's just
yeah. So
it's a struggle.
The reality is it's really it's not a linear checklist. It's a super complicated 3D Venn diagram. And that's probably a visual that's too complex, but the way I like to describe it is MITRE then turns into a heat map. So a heat map of, like you just explained, I mean, we're really heavy in execution, but we're light here. Let's focus, let's shift our focus to where we're lighter to try to round out that visibility and then that ultimate security. So it still lights up colors, but it's a very, very different way to look at it.
And let's continue that by saying, okay, if the map we're using is this heat map of MITRE techniques, now let's fold in something like Sight, some sort of AdSim or offensive tooling. Now, all of a sudden, as defenders, we have a taxonomy, a classification to say, we need your help with two things. One, validate our assumptions on the heat map of where we think we're strong. We should always validate whenever we think we're good.
Yeah, stress test it.
We need to back that. And two, help trigger wherever we're not good. So help exercise the logs, the technologies we have, our current processes with this area where we're weaker. And let's get better at it. So now all of a sudden, we can start using the heat map to guide not only backing our assumptions of good, but expanding coverage into where we're not good. And now all of a sudden, MITRE ATT&CK becomes a communication tool as opposed to a definitive we're protected list, which I don't think that's what they ever intended it to be. It was not supposed to be an all-encompassing checklist. It was meant to facilitate dialogue discussing nuances of attacks.
Yeah. And that folds perfectly back into the first question from today, which is, how do I prioritize? And this is a very powerful tool for that. Once you, number one, kind of see where you're at, and then number two, where do you want to go next? So it's a focal point.
Exactly.
It's a focal point using very deliberate sort of approaches and strategies, because there's so many layers and complexities here. So all right, well, I think that is an excellent first episode of Blue Line with Dr. Stu.
How do we get more of these questions?
That is a great question. And so I think that's the call to action today, is for listeners to think about, especially these sort of grayer issues in defensive security and threat detection sort of strategy, even, SOC operations on the analyst side, which we spend a lot of time talking about in other episodes. So ask us your questions, Slack us on our Slack, email us. It'd be cool if we could get some audio recordings. I think that'd be fun to play instead of you guys listening to me drone on. But get us your questions. We will obviously keep you anonymous. So hopefully you can get a little bit vulnerable, or even just say, hey, I'm pounding my head against the wall here, and here because of this and that. Or, we talked about misaligned incentives a lot in previous episodes. So like, that's not an easy thing to sort out and unpack. So there are definitely organizational dynamics and people dynamics at play here. So, get us your deepest or most frustrating or impossible question, challenge, and we're happy to try to unpack it and just provide any insight or guidance we can. So, and I kind of another thing I noticed as we were talking here is, these are strategic questions. These are kind of bigger thoughts or ideas, but the direction and the path forward is very technically grounded, right? That's why the real answer is it depends. So like to overcome some of these challenges or really dial in where you're trying to do as a program, it takes technical knowledge, it takes experience, and that, Stuart and I spend a lot of time, again, working with the practitioners in all these different companies. And the thing that we talk about adjacent to that is you're doing the work today, but you are the future leaders of tomorrow. And that's how we're going to be successful as an industry, protecting the companies we protect, is by taking these journeys, having these discussions, thinking critically, and making decisions deliberately about this is what we're going to do from a detection standpoint, but also from a program standpoint. So, And
I think building out your sounding boards, like where can you feel comfortable? Like you may say, hey, this is kind of a wacky idea, or, I feel frustrated by this and here's how I want to approach it. Yeah, sound it out. Ask it. Like that's how we're all going to get better here. Because I guarantee whatever you're struggling with, I guarantee we know someone else who is almost in an identical spot and could really use the encouragement of someone stepping up and asking.
At 100%. And that was the motivation for even this Q&A session and the podcast in general. So you might feel alone, but because Stuart and I have been doing this for over 3 years and been in dozens of larger companies, we know you're actually not alone. So, so with that, we'll wrap up today's episode. Again, think of questions or issues or roadblocks and share them with us, or feel free to reach out to Stuart and I if you want to talk about your individual scenario or where you're trying to get to. We're happy to do that as well and not broadcast it all over the world. And check us out on social media. Check out our website, outpost-security.com. We've got to sign up for our Slack. That is outpost-security.com/Slack sign up. But it should be in that top menu. Of course, we're on LinkedIn and the RBA community, which we mentioned earlier with our pretty frequent events. So with that, thank you for tuning in. We appreciate all you listening. Please subscribe or follow or leave a review. We're excited to keep continuing recording these and producing these. So we look forward to having you join us next time. So have a great day, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening to the Outpost RBA Podcast. Stuart McIntosh has over 20 years of experience building and maturing security programs inside Fortune 500 companies. In 2018, he gave a talk at Splunks.conf titled "Say Goodbye to Your Big Alert Pipeline and Say Hello to Your New Risk-Based Approach," which started the rise of RBA. As the creator and architect of risk-based alerting, he pioneers security methodologies at Outpost Security, which he co-founded with Will. Will Robus has spent the last 20 years in the operations or financial C-suites at technology and security companies, focused on what drives results and successful scaling. At Outpost Security, he works with CISOs to imagine a more expansive future for their SOC, once it has a solid RBA foundation. Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Share it with your security team and CISO. Connect with us on LinkedIn. And contact us at outpost-security.com to lift your team out of the fog of alert confusion with RBA 0 to 1.